$2, the auctioneer said, and not a penny more offered for the whole lot of you people. Mara Colby stood on the platform with her wrists bound in front of her, and she did not flinch. She had promised herself in the wagon that morning that she would not flinch again, not for any of them. Not the buyers with their tobacco-stained teeth. Not the women who covered their children's eyes as if her existence were catching. Not the auctioneer who called her damaged goods because of the scar that ran from her collarbone to her jaw. The scar was from a fire. The fire had taken her father, her home, and 3 years of her life spent drifting from one relative's charity to the next, until the debts came due and there was no one left to pay them but her. Dust rose off the square in thin gold ribbons. The heat pressed down like a hand on the back of her neck. Somewhere behind her a horse stamped and blew, impatient, and she envied it. An animal, at least, was not for sale by the pound. Come now, the auctioneer barked. Somebody bid on the girl. Silence answered him. Mara kept her chin level and her eyes on the horizon beyond the buyers' hats, where the mountains cut the sky in a jagged blue line. She thought, if no one bids, they will send me back to the poorhouse in Cheyenne, and I will not survive another winter there. That was when the man at the back of the crowd raised 2 fingers. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't pushed forward. He simply lifted 2 fingers the way a man might signal a bartender for a second drink. And the auctioneer, startled, said, $2, sold, to the man in back. The crowd turned to look, and so did Mara. He was tall in the way that mountain men get tall, shoulders built from an axe and not a desk, a hat pulled low enough that she couldn't read his eyes until he came closer. When he did, she saw the scar. Not hers, his, a pale seam that ran from his left temple down through his eyebrow and stopped just short of his eye, as if whatever blade had made it had changed its mind at the last moment. He didn't smile. He didn't look at her the way the others had, weighing her like livestock. He simply reached into his coat, counted out $2 silver into the auctioneer's palm, and said, I'll take her contract, not her person. Cross out whatever it says about ownership and right employment, instead, or there's no deal. The auctioneer blinked. Employment, that's the word, the man said, or I keep my money. The auctioneer scratched the paper. Mara stared at the stranger, her pulse a hard, confused thing in her throat. $2. He had paid $2 for her, and the first thing he'd done was refuse to own her. What's your name? She asked, when he cut the rope from her wrists with a knife that had clearly skinned more animals than men. Ezra Cole, he said. I've got a horse ranch 2 days north, up past the Talone River crossing. I need someone who can cook, keep books, and not scream at the sight of blood, on account of I do my own doctoring up there and it isn't pretty. And if I say no, then I'll drive you to the mission in Laramie myself and you can start over there instead. I didn't buy a person today, Miss Colby. Mara Colby. Miss Colby. I bought a chance to hire somebody decent before the wrong kind of man did instead. His eyes finally met hers, gray as river stone, steady. That's the whole of it. You're safe with me. I know that's a hard thing to believe from a stranger's mouth. You don't have to believe it today. Just come see the place before you decide anything. Around them the crowd had already lost interest, moving on to the next lot. A wagon of tools, a crate of hens. Mara looked at her raw wrists, at the $2 now folded into the auctioneer's ledger, at the mountains beyond this man's shoulder. She thought of the poorhouse. She thought of the fire. She thought, with a kind of exhausted clarity, that she had nothing left to lose that hadn't already been taken from her once. All right, she said. 2 days north, you said. 2 days? Ezra agreed, and something in his jaw eased, just slightly, like a man who had been braced for a blow that never landed. We'd best get moving before the weather turns. He didn't offer his arm. He didn't touch her at all. He simply turned and walked toward a wagon loaded with sacks of flour and coils of new rope, and after a long moment Mara followed him, one careful step and then another, out of the square and toward a life she could not yet see the shape of. Behind them, the auctioneer's voice rose again, selling someone else's future for whatever coin the crowd would offer. The wagon groaned over the ruts of the North Road, and for the first hour neither of them spoke. Mara sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the town shrink behind them, half expecting Ezra to turn the horses around and confess the whole thing had been a joke. a cruelty dressed up as kindness. He didn't. "There's stew in the tin behind you," he said finally, nodding without looking. "You haven't eaten today. I watched you on that platform. You'd have fallen over by sundown. You were watching me before you bid?" "I was watching the crowd," he said. "Man learns more about people by watching who looks away than who looks at." She found the tin, ate in small careful bites, and used to food offered without a price attached. The stew was plain: beans, salt pork, a little wild onion, but it was warm, and she found her hands had stopped shaking somewhere between the second spoonful and the third. "Why'd you really do it?" she asked. $2 for a stranger's contract. Man doesn't do that for nothing. Ezra was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, 5 years back, I watched a girl sold at that same auction to a man everybody in 3 counties knew was cruel. I was 19. I had $4 to my name, and I spent it all on whiskey that night instead of speaking up. Because speaking up wasn't my business. His hands tightened, just barely, on the reins. She died the next winter, froze in a woodshed for burning his supper. I heard about it secondhand, like gossip, like it wasn't a life that had ended. Mara said nothing. The wind moved through the grass on either side of the road in long silver waves. "I don't buy people," Ezra said. "I told you that back there, and I meant it. But when I've got $2 and a wagon big enough for one more, and I see the same thing about to happen twice, I'm not going to just watch this time." "That's not an answer to why you picked me." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He didn't elaborate further, and she didn't push, though she noted, filed away, the way she'd learned to file away every small true thing a man let slip, that he hadn't denied there being a reason beyond guilt. They made camp that evening in a stand of cottonwoods beside a creek, and it was there the first real test came. 2 riders found them at dusk. Rough men, trail dust ground into their collars, the kind of men who looked at a lone woman the way wolves look at a lamb that's strayed from the flock. "That yours?" one of them asked Ezra, jerking his chin at Mara without so much as a greeting. "She works for me," Ezra said. He hadn't stood up from the fire. He hadn't reached for the rifle leaning against the wagon wheel, either, though Mara noticed his hand had drifted to rest near it, unhurried, like a man settling into a chair. "Auction girl, ain't she? Saw her sold this morning. Cheap price for a pretty face." The second rider grinned, showing a gap where a tooth should have been. "Maybe we ought to make you a better offer." The fire cracked. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called once and went silent. "She's not for sale," Ezra said, and his voice hadn't changed at all. Still even, still low, but something underneath it had gone hard as riverbed stone. "Wasn't this morning either, whatever the auctioneer called it. You're welcome to share the fire and move on come first light. That's the only offer standing tonight." The 2 riders looked at each other, looked at the rifle within Ezra's reach, looked, finally, at Mara, who had not lowered her eyes, who had learned on that platform that looking away only invited more. "Ain't worth the trouble," the first rider muttered, and they rode on into the dark without another word. Mara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You'd have shot them." "I'd have tried not to," Ezra said, "but I'd have done what needed doing." He finally looked at her, and there was something raw in it, something that hadn't been there in town. "You didn't flinch. Most folks would have hid behind the wagon." "I've had worse things than 2 riders look at me like that," Mara said, before she could stop herself, and then wished the words back the moment they left her mouth. Ezra didn't press. He only nodded, slow, like he was filing that away too, the same way she'd been filing him. "Get some sleep," he said instead. "I'll take first watch." She lay awake a long while anyway, listening to the creak and the low crackle of the dying fire, aware of the shape of him sitting sentinel at its edge. A stranger who had spent his last $2 on a chance instead of a whiskey bottle, who had let a threat pass without violence but hadn't backed down from it either. It was not safety exactly what she felt watching him, but it was closer to it than she'd come in a long time. They reached the Talone River crossing on the afternoon of the second day, and it was there that the trouble that had been trailing them since town finally caught up. Mara heard the hoofbeats before Ezra did. A low drumming through the ground that she'd learned to recognize during the fire, back when riders had come thundering in to help too late to save anything but the barn. She grabbed his sleeve. "Riders, coming fast. Ezra was already turning the wagon toward a stand of rock that broke the open plain like a fist through paper. Get down behind the wheel when we stop. Whatever happens, don't stand up. Who is it? Judge Corwin's men, most like. His jaw was tight. Man's had his eye on my ranch for 2 years. Ever since I refused to sell him the water rights on the river. He's not above hiring men to make an accident look like bad luck. The wagon lurched to a stop behind the rocks and Ezra was down and moving before the dust settled. Rifle already in hand. Mara crouched where he'd told her, heart slamming, and watched 3 riders crest the rise, hard men, the kind whose faces had gone flat and mean from doing this kind of work too many times to count. Cole, one of them shouted. Judge wants a word about that water. Tell the judge I said what I said in town. Ezra called back, voice carrying flat and even across the grass. The river stays open. Man downstream's got as much right to it as the man up. Judge don't much care for being told no twice. Then he can ride out here and say so to my face instead of sending 3 men to do it for him. The lead rider's hand drifted to his hip. Mara's breath caught, and then everything happened at once. Fast the way a lightning strike is fast, all at once and then already over. The rider drew. Ezra fired a warning shot into the dirt in front of the horse's hooves, close enough that the animal reared and threw its rider hard onto the ground. The other 2 scrambled for their own weapons, and Ezra was already moving, using the rock for cover. His second shot clipping the rifle clean out of a second man's hands with a crack that echoed off the stone. Next one doesn't miss, Ezra said, and something in the flatness of his voice must have convinced them, because after a long, ugly moment, the 2 standing riders hauled their fallen companion up onto his horse and wheeled away, cursing, back the way they'd come. Silence rushed back into the space where the gunfire had been. Mara realized she'd stopped breathing somewhere in the middle of it and made herself start again. Ezra came back around the rocks, and it was only then she saw the blood. A dark stain spreading along his left arm, torn where a stray shot had grazed him in the chaos. You're hurt. It's shallow. But his face had gone pale under the tan, and when he tried to holster the rifle his hand wasn't quite steady. Sit down, she said, and there was no room for argument in it. The same flat command he'd used on the riders, turned now to gentler use. She tore a strip from her petticoat before he could object, pressed it hard against the wound, felt him flinch under her hands for the first time since she'd met him. You've done this before, he said. Teeth gritted. My father was a blacksmith. Burns, cuts. I patched worse than this more times than I can count, before the fire took him. Her hands worked steady even as her mind spun. Why does the judge want your water so bad he'd send men to kill for it? Because I won't sell it, and because the man he really wants dead isn't me at all. Ezra's eyes had gone distant, the way a man's eyes go when he's looking backward instead of forward. It's the family I took the ranch in from. Man who owned it before me was hiding from Corwin's kind of trouble long before I ever bought the place. I didn't know that when I bought it. Found out after, by then it was already my fight too. Mara tied off the bandage. Her fingers steady despite the tremor she could feel starting somewhere under her ribs. And you never thought to mention that the man who bought my contract might be riding me straight into a range war? I thought about it, Ezra admitted, quiet. Didn't figure it'd change your mind about coming. Might have been wrong about that. She looked at him, pale, bleeding, stubborn as stone, having just put himself between her and 3 armed men without a moment's hesitation, and found, to her own surprise, that it hadn't changed her mind at all. Get up, she said instead. We need to get that arm properly cleaned before it festers, and you need to tell me everything about this Judge Corwin before we go 1 mile further. They made camp early that night, only a few miles short of the ranch, because Ezra's arm needed proper tending and neither of them trusted the dark with him weakened. Mara built the fire herself while he sat with his back against a wagon wheel, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite place. Something between gratitude and wariness, as if he wasn't sure yet what to do with being cared for. Hold still, she said, cleaning the wound by firelight with water boiled from the creek and a strip of clean cloth. This is going to hurt. Already hurts. Then it'll hurt worse for a minute, and then it'll hurt less than it did. She worked with quiet efficiency, the way her father had taught her. Pressure here, a careful stitch there, her needle catching the firelight. Ezra didn't make a sound, though she felt the muscles in his arm go rigid under her hands. You never finished telling me, she said, to distract him as much as herself, why you really picked me at that auction. Not the girl in the woodshed. The real reason. He was quiet long enough that she thought, again, he wouldn't answer. Then, lo, you had a scar like mine. Saw it the second I looked at you properly, collarbone to jaw, old burn by the look of it. Everybody else in that crowd saw damaged goods. I saw somebody who'd survived something that should have killed her and was still standing straight enough to look the whole world in the eye about it. His hand, the good one, came up, briefly, to touch the pale seam through his own eyebrow. Got mine in a fire too. My brother's cabin 6 years back. I got him out. Couldn't get my sister-in-law out in time. His voice roughened. Scars mean it lived, my grandmother used to say. Doesn't mean it doesn't still ache some nights. Mara's hands stilled on the bandage. I'm sorry. About your brother's wife. I'm sorry about your father. He said it simply, without pity, which was somehow the only way she could have borne hearing it. That's why the fire? The one that took him? Lightning struck the forge in a summer storm. Whole place went up before anyone could stop it. I got out through the window. He didn't. She tied off the last stitch, her voice steady only because she'd had 3 years to practice steadying it. Everyone after that treated me like the scar was catching. Like grief was something you could get on your hands if you touched me wrong. It isn't. Ezra reached into his coat with his good hand and drew out something small, wrapped in a scrap of leather. A carved wooden token, rough-edged, clearly whittled by an unpracticed hand. A horse, mid-stride, its mane caught in an eternal gallop. My brother carved this for his wife before the fire. Only thing of hers I ever recovered from the ashes. I've carried it 6 years like it was something holy. He held it out to her. I want you to have it. Ezra, I can't take. You can, he said, quiet and certain. I've kept it as a kind of penance, I think, proof I remembered what I lost. But penance isn't the same as living, and I think I've been doing more of the first than the second for longer than I'd like to admit. His eyes met hers, steady despite the pain still etched at their corners. I think it's time it belonged to somebody moving forward instead of somebody stuck looking back. You're the first person since the fire I've wanted to look forward with. Mara closed her fingers around the little wooden horse, feeling the rough grain of it, warm from his pocket. I bought a rifle with my grandmother's wedding ring, once, she said softly, when the money for my father's burial ran short. Sold every scrap of the past I had. This is the first thing anyone's given me since that wasn't asking for something in return. It isn't, he agreed. Won't ever be. The fire popped between them, throwing shadows across the grass, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, because it seemed nothing needed saying that the silence hadn't already said better. Overhead, the mountain sky had gone thick with stars, indifferent and vast and somehow, in that moment, less lonely than they had ever looked to her before. Judge Corwin won't stop with today, Ezra said finally, the warmth of the moment giving way, gently, to the weight still waiting for them. Tomorrow, once we're home, he'll know exactly where to find us both. Then tomorrow we'll be ready for him, Mara said, and found she meant it. Found that somewhere between the auction block and this fire, we had become a word she was willing to use. They reached the ranch by mid-morning, and Judge Corwin's men reached it by noon. There were 6 of them this time, and Corwin himself rode at the front. A heavy-set man in a coat too fine for open country. His face set in the particular calm of someone who had never once in his life expected to be told no and meant it. Cole, he called out, reining up at the edge of the yard. You cost me a man's rifle hand yesterday. I'm here to collect on the water rights, one way or another, and I'd rather it be the easy way. Ezra stood in the yard with his wounded arm in a sling and his rifle in his good hand, and beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, stood Mara, a shotgun she'd found in the barn held steady across her own arms. The easy way's the same as it's always been, Ezra said. River stays open. You want a war over it, you'll have to answer to the marshal in Laramie for it, same as everyone downstream who depends on that water same as I do. Marshal's 3 days' ride from here, Corwin said, smiling thin. Whatever happens today, it'll be settled long before he arrives. Then it's a good thing, said a new voice, that I rode out here yesterday morning instead of waiting. A rider emerged from the tree line behind Corwin's men. A woman in a marshal's badge, flanked by 2 deputies, her rifle already raised and steady. Judge Corwin, I've had a formal complaint of attempted murder filed against you as of this morning, backed by 2 witnesses to yesterday's shooting on the North Road. You're going to want to think very carefully about what you do in the next 60 seconds. Corwin's face went the color of old ash. His men, sensing the balance of the moment tip, shifted uneasily in their saddles. Men paid to intimidate, not men paid to hang. This isn't finished, Corwin said low to Ezra alone. It is, though, Ezra said. It's been finished since the day you decided a river belonged to you more than the people who needed it to live. Right on, Judge. The marshal's got questions for you, and I imagine you'd rather answer them without an audience. For a long, taut moment, nothing moved. Then Corwin wheeled his horse and his men followed, and the yard emptied of threat as quickly as it had filled with it, leaving only the marshal, who tipped her hat to Ezra with the ghost of a smile, and rode on after them to see the matter properly finished in town. Mara lowered the shotgun slowly, her hands trembling now that there was nothing left to steady them for. Ezra turned to her, and for the first time since the auction block, she saw something in his face that wasn't guarded at all, something open, and a little afraid, in the particular way of a man who has decided to want something and is only now realizing how much. You didn't run, he said. Neither did you. I had a ranch to lose. You didn't have to stay for any of this. His good hand came up, hesitant, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face. From the old pale scar along her jaw, touching it the way he might touch something precious rather than something ruined. You could have taken the wagon at any point these past 2 days and gone your own way. I know, Mara said. I didn't want to. She thought of the wooden horse, still tucked safe in her pocket, mid-gallop and never arriving. The way she herself had felt for 3 long years, always moving, never landing anywhere that felt like it might hold. You said I was safe with you before you'd even cut the rope off my wrists. I didn't believe you then. I think I might believe you now. Good, Ezra said, quiet, and something in his voice cracked open just slightly at the edges. Because I meant to keep saying it a good long while, if you'll let me. She didn't answer with words. She answered by staying, by reaching up and closing her hand over his where it rested against her scarred cheek, and holding it there, in the dust and sunlight of a yard that had nearly run red that morning and instead had simply, quietly, become the first place in years that felt like it might be hers to keep. Years later, travelers passing through the Talone River crossing would sometimes stop at the Cole Ranch for water, and if they asked about the carved wooden horse that sat on the mantel, worn smooth from years of a woman's thumb passing over it, Mara would tell them only that it had been a gift from a man who'd once paid $2 for a stranger's freedom, and never once, in all the years after, asked anything of her in return but to stay. The river still ran open past their land, same as it always had. And some evenings, if the light caught it right, 2 figures could be seen walking the fence line together at dusk, unhurried, in no rush at all to be anywhere but exactly where they already were.